My name is Suman Chen. I will also be joined by Ken Shaw. Ken will be giving most of the presentation, and I'll do some of the background in each section. So we are located in the Boston area, and as many of you may have heard, we've had a little bit of snow, about 9 feet, most of it falling in a period of about 30 days in mid-February, March. And these huge mounds of snow started developing, and you really couldn't see around them. So what we thought analogous to our SQL Server and Oracle licensing is that you really wanted to plow through these mounds to get a clearer view. So our approach really is to try to put some structure around these licensing, these complex licensing rules and how to apply them. So hopefully we'll be able to do that today for you. This is the outline of our presentation today. We'll first go into SQL Server, discussing the additions, what licensing options there are, and then maybe most importantly, how to actually achieve compliance with a number of examples there. Oracle will follow the same structure, talking about the additions, the licensing options, and then how to achieve compliance. So let's get started. We will focus primarily on SQL Server 2012-2014 additions. And Enterprise is the big boy, mission-critical data warehousing environments. Business intelligence is more for limited groups within the organization that need the BI capabilities. Standard is the basic version, reporting and analytics and security. Web is for web hosting, and Developer and Express are specialized editions, either low cost or free for independent software vendors. And they, of course, come with limited size and performance. There are some capacity limits that you should be aware of in the different SQL Server editions. As you can see here, Enterprise per core is the operating system maximum, and of course a lot of database size. Enterprise Server version, and this is a upgrade from 2008 server only. That's limited, physically limited to 20 cores, and you can see all the other physical limits on the business intelligence, standard, and web and express is down to 1 socket and 4 cores. So there are some pretty major feature differences, and here we list the ones that are Enterprise Edition only features, and don't want to run through all of these, but they very much focus on improving management, improving performance. The always-on availability is a way for to fail over groups of databases, not just a single database. And then the transparent database encryption is a feature that definitely, I'm sure the CEO of Target and more recently Anthem Healthcare wishes they had implemented. And then security auditing and more BI. But Enterprise is expensive. It's about 4 times the cost of Standard. So as you see here, at $6,800 per core with a 4-core minimum, you're talking about $27,000 for the minimum, and that compares to a little under $7,000 for the Standard. And these are list prices. So now I will turn it over to Ken, who will go into depth about the additions and licensing options. Ken?
Okay. So the basic way SQL Server divides up is by edition and then by license type. So Suman went over the additions. In these examples, we'll be covering just 3 editions, which is Enterprise, BI, and Standard. So the 2 license types today, and by today I mean in 2012 and 2014, are either by core or by server. And with Enterprise, you basically don't have a choice. It's by core unless you have a legacy Enterprise. And in BI, it has to be by server. So the only edition that you have a choice in between the license types is Standard, and you can do either one. So some important things to keep in mind about the licensing that applies to everything. One is that licenses are assigned to physical servers. So when you're toting up your license compliance, you're trying to tote up the number of licenses for each physical server. So if you have SQL Server installed on virtual servers, that's fine. But you're not going to tote up the virtual servers and say, this is what I've got. You've got to translate that into the physical server hosts of those virtual servers. In general, when you're licensing by core, for each core that you use, you need one license. We'll go into that in more detail. And similarly, if you do it by server, it's one license per server, although there are some variations on that, as we'll see. But that's the general background. Okay, whoops. Am I right where I should have been? It's not. Okay. Wasn't responding to my keyboard at first there. Okay, so some more on the general rules that apply across all the editions. Number one is if you have multiple SQL Server instances installed in an OSE is an operating system environment, so it means a physical computer or a virtual machine. If you have multiple SQL Server instances, that doesn't matter. You just have to license one of them. So that's a complicating factor that you don't have to pay attention to. That's not true for all Microsoft products, but it is for SQL Server. The second and third items here are about these minimums, which is a 4-core minimum. So if you're doing things by core and you've got an OSE or a physical box that only has one core, when you count the number of cores, you'll have to count one as 4, or if you have 2, you'll have to count those as 4. So that's a complicating factor to always keep in mind. And it might cost you more than you think, too, if you're just thinking, oh, I'm using one core. I need one license. No, you'll actually need at least 4 in most cases. And then finally about hyperthreading. A hyperthreaded core is one that's almost like 2 cores. It's an Intel CPU feature. And Microsoft treats that differently for physical cores versus virtual machines. If you're doing things by physical cores, as we'll see, you can ignore the hyperthreading of the core. But if you're doing things by virtual, then you have to treat each hyperthread as if it were its own core. So that's an important difference. And that also means that if you're running SQL Server in virtual environments, you need to know about the hyperthreading of the cores. Okay, so let's get into the specifics of each edition and license type, and we'll start from the bottom. So we have standard and BI. And we have standard and BI together because when it's per server, they follow exactly the same rules. So as I said earlier, in the general rules, if you are using one server, you need one license, and that's an OSE, whether it's virtual or physical. And to see how many licenses are required, just count up all the OSEs that SQL Server is running in. Keep in mind that when you're doing it per server, you also have to have CALs for all the users and devices that access it. And that's a whole other ball of wax as far as counting that up, since that's not something that's measured by the database. You have to go through other ways of doing it that are tedious. Okay, let's do some examples. So let's say that you're running in the physical operating system environment, not the virtual. So this blue box on the left represents the server, and it's a server that has 4 CPUs, and each CPU has 4 cores. So if we're licensing it by server, we can see that there's 16 cores, but that doesn't matter. The cores don't matter. It's simply there's one server, so you need one license, one server license, plus CALs. On the other hand, if you're doing virtuals, and as you're running in VOSEs, it's a little more complicated. In this example here, we've got the same physical server, but you see there are 2 blue boxes representing that we have 2 virtual machines installed in it, and each of them has 2 of the CPUs, which amount to 8 cores in each. But again, the cores don't matter, so it's just we have 2 blue boxes, and therefore we need 2 server licenses. And again, we need CALs, and of course you need CALs for the accesses to each server. Okay, so we'll stick with standard here. Remember, we don't need to talk about BIN core because that's not supported by Microsoft. So in the case of standard per core, whether you're using physical or virtual cores, it's 1 license per core. And to see how many you're using in total, if you're running SQL Server in the physical environment, then you just count up all the physical cores. It doesn't matter if you're running SQL Server and somehow SQL Server is configured only to use some of the cores. That doesn't matter. You count all the physical cores on the computer. On the other hand, if you're running in a virtual environment, you do something similar, which is to count all the virtual cores that are being used in the VOSEs that are running SQL Server. So it's not all the virtual cores that might be on that physical box, but just the virtual cores in the VOSEs that are running SQL Server. And then for the grand total on that physical box, you just add up all the cores that you counted, both in the physical environment and the virtual environment. And since it's per core, you don't need CALs. So once you've toted up the number of core licenses you need, you're done. There's nothing else to do. Okay, so we'll go into a couple of examples first per core. So we have the same computer that I showed earlier. It's got 4 CPUs and 4 cores in each CPU. So there's a total of 16 cores, and that means that you need 16 core licenses. It is multiplied by a core factor, and there's a Microsoft table that describes the core factor. Most of the core factor is saying you need the minimum of 4, but there are also some special rules for certain AMD processors. And of course, no CALs to be counted. Okay, so now we'll switch over to a virtual case. So we've got that same computer, and it's been divided up into 2 VOSEs, but they're not identical. You see the one on the left only contains 1 CPU, whereas the one on the right contains 2 CPUs. And the one on the left not only has the 1 CPU, but it's just using 2 of the cores on that CPU, not all 4 of them. So following the rules, we look at the VOSE on the left, and we say, okay, we've got 2 cores, but the minimum is 4, so the one on the left has to be counted as 4 cores. And then the one on the right has 8 cores, so it is 8 cores. So we add those up, 8 and 4, and we end up with 12. So that requires 12 core licenses, which is a savings over the total of 16 on the physical machine. So by doing it this way with the virtuals, we have saved money versus running these SQL servers on the physical machine. By the way, some companies call this capability subcapacity licensing, where you don't have to pay for the whole physical capacity. And of course, no CALs are required. Just to note here on the virtual cores, sometimes people get confused how to count them, as far as the connection between processors, cores, and hyperthreads. So I have a couple of examples here, and each of these examples should be counted as a total of 4 virtual cores. So in the first case, we're talking about 4 CPUs, and each CPU has 1 core. So that's 4 times 1 counts as 4 cores. In the second case, there's just 2 CPUs, but each CPU has 2 physical cores. And in the case where the VOSE is using all of those, that also adds up to 4 virtual cores. And then finally, the last case is there's a single CPU that has 2 cores, 2 physical cores, and each core is hyperthreaded, meaning it has 2 hyperthreaded parts to it. So that also is 2 times 2, or a total of 4 cores when you're counting them as virtual cores, even though there's only 2 physical ones. Okay, so let's move up to the Enterprise Edition, and we'll go back to the per server license type. And as I said earlier, that's a legacy. You cannot purchase that today, but you can have it if you purchased it back in 2008 and have been upgrading it ever since. This violates the general rule about 1 license per OSE, because in this case, 1 license entitles you to 4 OSEs. And that could be 4 virtuals or 1 physical and 3 virtuals on the same physical box. And then you count all the used OSEs, meaning all the OSEs that are running SQL Server get counted. And then, of course, you have to get the CALs. And there is a limitation. You can't just put this on the biggest box in the world. If you want to use the biggest box in the world, you have to enter license per core. When you do it per server, they limit your functionality in that way. Okay, I won't go through any rules on that one because it's legacy. So we'll come to the last case, which is the Enterprise Edition with the per core license type. And this is more complicated than any of the other cases because Microsoft gives you some options on how to do it if you're running in the virtuals. So first, same general rule as far as for each core, you need 1 license. As far as how you count them, you do it one way in the physical and one way in the virtual. So in the case of the physical, it's like standard. You just have to count up all the physical cores. And if you are running SQL Server on the physical box, the only way you can license it is by the physical cores. So if you're running on the physical box, you have to count all the physical cores. On the other hand, if you're running only in virtuals, then you have 2 different ways you can count, and you're entitled to pick the lower count. You can either count by the physical cores or by the virtual cores that are being used. And then you pick the lower count. So basically, if you're using a bunch of virtuals that are perhaps using up effectively all the physical cores, then you might want to count by physical cores. But if you're using just a small portion of the physical box, say it's got 32 cores and you've got a virtual that's running with 4 cores, then you'd probably want to count by virtual cores. And then one note here, this bonus, which gives you so-called unlimited virtualization. That means if you have maintenance or software assurance, as Microsoft calls it, and you decided to license by the physical cores, which means you're paying for all the physical cores, you can put an unlimited number of VOSEs on there. On the other hand, if you don't have SA and you license by physical, you're limited to the number of physical cores. You can't go beyond that unless you purchase even more licenses. So it's really if you're stuffing the box with virtual machines for some reason that the SA gives you a benefit. Okay, so some examples. So we'll start out with the physical example. Got the same box with 4 CPUs and 4 cores on each CPU. So you're using 16 cores because they say you're using them all, whether you are or not. So you need 16 licenses. That's pretty straightforward. In the next example, we'll switch over to running in the VOSEs. And in this case, we're talking about, we're not actually showing the VOSEs, we're just showing the physical box. But basically, you need to count the number of cores that are being used. So as shown here, we're using all the cores. That is, we're using 16 virtual cores in this case, which is using up all the physical cores. Anyhow, if you're using the 16 cores, 16 virtual cores, then you need to get 16 enterprise licenses. If you were just running, say, on one of the CPUs and using all the cores, that'd be 4 cores, then you would need to get 4 licenses. The one thing to note about this case where you're, actually it's the previous case, I didn't point this out, I want to go back. If you're in this case here where you're using all the physical cores, but I mean you had virtuals and you're using all the physicals, you're able to use all that many and still just have 16 licenses. So this is the one way that you can escape that 4-core minimum. In this case, it's 1 core for each of the 16 VOSEs, but you don't have to say 16 times 4, it's just 16 times 1. So that's a benefit of doing things by physical when you have a lot of virtuals with the Enterprise Edition. Okay, so we have one last example, and in this case we're not using up the whole box. And you see on the left we're just using one CPU and 2 cores of it, and then the right VLSC we're using up 8. So again, the 2 on the left have to be bumped up to 4. This is where we're just doing things by virtuals. We're not getting that benefit of doing all the physicals. So you have to bump the 2 to the 4, and then using 8 on the right. So the 8 and 4 is 12. If I went through that too fast, note your questions down or ask them to the presenter now, and we can go over it again when we get to the Q&A. Okay, I'll turn it back over to Sumin now.
Great. Thanks, Ken. So a couple of issues that come up to consider. Obviously, as Ken has mentioned, there are options on server cal licensing or core licensing, and obviously it's your option. So what type, how should you decide which license type? So this is relevant to, I should point out, obviously, this is relevant to the standard edition today only. So you really want to think about user cals in a couple of situations. One is obviously you need to be able to count the users, and they can't be too large. But also a real benefit is that once a user has a cal, then they can access any number of SQL Server databases within your enterprise. So in situations where you've got multiple applications running multiple databases, that may be something to consider, particularly if you can count those users. Device cals are typically used in some kiosk kinds of applications where you've got many, many users, but you can count the number of devices. And then the core option is obviously for large numbers of users, not easily counted. Things like public-facing web-based applications is a good example. And if you're purchasing a new version of Enterprise Edition, this licensing metric is required. The other question that often comes up is, what about software assurance? And this is really not, for SQL Server, this is really not like software assurance for other Microsoft applications. They're like Office. There really are a lot of rights that Microsoft has been placing that are only available with SA. So as Ken has mentioned before, the unlimited number of VMs for enterprise core licenses when you license by physical server, that's only available with SA, and that's a pretty big benefit. License mobility is a situation that removes the 90-day limit for server farms, and you still have the 90-day limit on clouds, but for server farms that's been removed. And then, of course, if you wanted to upgrade your 2008 R2 processors to 2012 or 14 core licenses, that's only available under SA. And then under 2014, the only change was that the failover rights were only available under SA. That allows you to have a passive server for each active server. So something to consider on the SA side. Microsoft is clearly going in this direction with its server-based products. And I will turn it back over to Ken, and will show us how to actually put this information together and allow you to achieve compliance. Ken?
Okay. So what we're talking about here is a suggested process that you would follow. And when people first get assigned to doing SQL Server licensing, they can get kind of confused about where they should start and how they should organize things. And that's the question that we're trying to answer here. We're not going into gory detail. It's really the higher level that is helpful to keep you from going off in the wrong direction when you start. So this is a summary here of the process at a very high level, which is basically you need to discover what's installed. You need to discover or get together your entitlement records, what you've purchased, and then finally compare the two. And comparing the two means like to like. In other words, the comparison has to be each edition, version, and license type. installed versus each edition, version, and license type that's purchased. And that's where, for each of those where you want to see whether you're over or under licensed. Okay, so a little more detail on that. Starting with the discovery, the sequence we suggest is first, find all the SQL Server instances that you have installed. You might want to find them all, whether they require a paid license or not, so you have a complete set of records. But of course, you want to note for each instance whether it's one that requires a paid license or not. Might not require a paid license because it's Express Edition, or it might not because you purchased a license under some other program. Basically, what we're talking about here is the standard Microsoft licensing, sometimes called volume licensing. But you can get things under developer licenses, for example. So you want to identify those. And then finally, you might have a failover server. And when Suman said you have the right to a passive for an active when you have SA, that means that you could have two computers running SQL Server, and the one that you consider to be the failover, you don't have to pay for a license. So here's an example of what a spreadsheet might look like that has these instances. So first column where it says SQL Server Instance, that's the name. I made up colors for these, but it's whatever your IT guys name their instances, which is something they have to do when they do an installation. If they don't do anything, then I think by default they get called 1 and then 2 and then 3. So then we have the edition and the version, which is something that we discover. And then we note whether it requires a license. And you'll notice, for example, the bottom one has Edition Express. So we say that does not require a license. That's not necessarily something you discover, but that you apply your knowledge to specify whether the license is required. And then getting a little ahead, we note here which server it's installed on. And so these A1s or B1s are the made-up names of the servers that we're saying they're installed on. And then it's very important to note what kind of server they're on, whether it's a physical or a virtual. And P is for physical, V is for virtual. And then finally, the license type. And again, that's generally not discoverable. That's something that you should know, you or your colleagues. Okay, so the next step is to list all the physical servers. What I showed earlier was all the instances, and I did associate the servers with them. But now we're talking about all the physical servers. In that example, there was one SQL server running on the physical server and a bunch running on virtuals. So what you need to do is also discover all the physical hosts of the virtual servers, even though the physical host isn't running an instance and wasn't in the previous list. You need to identify that physical server too. So you've got all the physical servers directly running SQL Server and all the physical servers that are hosting virtual machines that are running SQL Server. And then for each of those physical servers, get the information about its processors and cores, how many processors and how many cores per processor, and whether they're hyper-threaded or not, since those all play into the rules, at least in certain license types. So, as I was already saying, it's important that your discovery tell you about the hyper-threading. And it's also important that your discovery tell you which virtual machines go with which physical hosts, because otherwise you can't count anything up correctly. So when you have all that information together, you can finally do your counting. And of course, there's a different set of rules for each edition, version, and license type, but you've got it broken down that way, so you can then apply the formulas. And what you should come up with is a total count per physical server. Again, the virtuals feed into the counting for the physical server, but the counts go with the physical server. So let's look at a table that shows that. So this is different from the earlier table. Let me point that out. So we've got the server column now on the left, and we have A1, which we had before. That's running enterprise directly on the physical machine. So you see the server type is P. But this next row, which is server B1, we didn't have that before. That's the physical host of these virtuals below it, and you'll see it's not running an instance of SQL Server, but it's here because it's the host of these two virtuals. And way over on the right, we have the number of CPUs and cores that it has. And then below we have the two virtuals. If you remember, there was a third virtual before, but that was running Express, which does not require a license, so we put that aside. So here are the two virtuals being hosted on the B1 physical. And so we have CPUs and cores for those, and since those are virtual, that means virtual CPUs and virtual cores. So finally, what we want to get out of this is this license type column, and that's where you apply the licensing rules. So in the case of the physical, we take the edition and the version and the CPUs and the cores, and we get the license count, which is a per core license type count. And then in the case of this other one, we have to take some combination of the physical CPUs and cores and the virtuals and apply the licensing rules described earlier, and finally get this total number of 8. And I believe in this case the 8 came because we decided to do it by virtuals, and we said, well, there's 2, but there's a minimum of 4, so that counts as 4. This is 2. That means a minimum of 4, so 4 and 4 is 8. And up here it's 16 because we have 16 cores, so just 1 for each core. Okay, so everything we looked at earlier is details, that it's each instance and each server. But the last step you need to do on the discovery data is to summarize it. And you want to summarize it by edition, version, and license type to get the total number of licenses required across all of your servers. So here's a summary table. So we've reduced it where there's 1 row per each edition and version and license type. And we have the totals from before, the 16 and 8. In a more realistic example, of course, there would have been many more rows in the earlier table, but this summary might still just use these 2 rows if it was just Enterprise 2014 and Standard 2014, and the license count numbers would be larger. Okay, so now we'll switch over to the other half of the whole function, which is what to do about your entitlements or purchases. So you want to organize those in the same way as far as comparing to instances out there. Obviously, you don't care about your servers when you're looking at your entitlements, but you need to break things down by the SQL Server edition, version, and license type, and perhaps the SA rights. I'm not going into that in detail, but that's another twist, that the SA rights can affect how you eventually reconcile the entitlements versus the discovered. So here's a suggested table of your purchases. So as I said, you want to break it down by edition, version, and license type, and then get the quantity that you purchased. So in this case, we're not doing a summary yet, so we've broken it down by purchase order. And in this example, each instance we have was on a different purchase order, so it's a different row here. And these are the quantities that you purchased that you got off your purchase records. So if you summarize that, it just comes down to these 2 rows, Enterprise 2014 per core and Standard 2014 by core, and the quantities, which were just added from the previous one. So it was 4 and 4 makes 8, and there was just 12 in the single row here. So just to summarize what we've done so far, we went through the discovery instance by instance and then turned that into a view per physical server. And then finally we summarized that by the SQL edition, version, and license type. And we went through a similar procedure here on the purchases where we got down to the summary by edition, version, and license type. And so the last step is just to compare them. So here's a table that combines the discovery summary table and the entitlements or purchased summary table. So the first 3 columns are what they have in common, which is the edition, the version, and the license type. And then the server count is some discovery information. and the install is more discovery information. And then the purchased is from your purchasing or entitlement information. And it's these two columns, the installed license count, which was ultimately computed by you according to the formulas, compared to your purchased, shows how many you're either over licensed or under licensed. And that tells you what you need to remedy or pay for. And just a note here that we do make a product called Bell Manage, which has a module designed for SQL Server license compliance. It's called the Bell Manage Data Analytics module. And this is just a screenshot of an actual report, which is an implementation of the kind of tables that we showed before. This one's actually showing the reconciliation. That is the summary of what's been discovered versus a summary of what's been purchased for each product in addition, and showing you what the discrepancy is, whether you're under licensed or over licensed, and combining that with actual dollar figures to show you what the dollar impact will be of truing up, or whether you've over purchased if it turns out you haven't installed everything that you purchased. Okay, with that, I'll turn it back over to Sumin to start on the Oracle licensing.
Great. Thank you, Ken. Yeah, so one of the points we wanted to make is that, automation is great because you can get a tool that can automate a lot of these steps, but obviously still you need to understand what the steps and what the process is, so that's really important. So in Oracle, again, we will go through similar steps, a little bit shorter because of time limitations, but we'll discuss the database additions. And what's very important in Oracle are the options and management packs. And then the different licensing options that you have with Oracle databases, and then how to achieve compliance. So we'll start on the additions. We'll start from the ground floor up. Express Edition is a very basic version, free version actually, but has limited processing and memory, but it has been used actually for many web-based applications because of the licensing metrics that are involved here. So it is something to consider. And it is the same core database as Enterprise. Personal Edition is great for development purposes, but excuse me, it only comes with a single user NUP license, named user plus license, that is. And it includes one of the things that interesting things about it. It does include all the features and options that are available with Enterprise, except for the real application cluster option that we'll discuss later. Standard Edition 1 is limited to 2 CPUs, and no options or management packs are available. Standard Edition is 4, and the RAC, the real application cluster option, is included. And then the Enterprise Edition is the big boy, no CPU limits, and all the options and management packs are available, but at a cost, of course. And we'll give you some examples of that shortly. This is a list of some of the options and packs that are available, and these are really what make Oracle an enterprise-based database for transaction processing, data mining, if you will. So one of the options that we've been talking about are the real application clusters, and that is a very slick capability in Oracle that allows Oracle to run on a cluster of servers pretty much transparently. So I won't go into all these options, but they're a very integral part of the Oracle database. These are the 2 license types that are currently available with Oracle licensing, the named user plus. And it's not just individuals, obviously also machines, barcode scanners, if you will, making use of the database. And obviously they count all the people, no matter if they're going through an aggregation mechanism or not, all the people that are actually accessing that and machines accessing that database. But as with SQL Server, once a user is licensed, they can have access to multiple databases. There are minimums that apply on the NUP licenses, and we will go into that shortly. Processor licenses are used obviously in situations where it's difficult to count users' internet-facing applications. And there are a couple of different ways that Oracle counts processors. So in Standard Edition, it's socket, what they call socket or CPU based, and that does really not consider any cores or hyperthreads. In Enterprise Edition, a processor is defined as a cores times a core factor. And the core factors are quite different than Microsoft's. For example, the Intel Xenon processor is a 0.5 core factor. So these are actually defined terms when we mention those in our presentation, sockets and processors. They are defined terms in Oracle licensing, so you need to be careful how you use those. So I will turn it over to Ken, who will go into the details. Ken?
Okay. Yeah, so we'll talk about the licensing rules here. And as with SQL Server, we'll talk about some general rules that apply to both editions and license types. And then we'll get into the rules for each edition and license type. So first, licenses are assigned to physical servers only. You can run Oracle in a virtual machine, but you don't license the virtual machine. You license the physical host of the virtual machine. All the metrics are based on the physical server characteristics. So unlike Microsoft,
B 326 11 14 34700.
Yeah. Does anybody have any control over that? It'd be nice to shut it off. Okay, I'll continue. So I was saying about the license metrics, in contrast to SQL Server, you only have the option to measure the physical server characteristics. You don't have that option to count the VOSEs and perhaps use subcapacity licensing. So in the industry, people would say Oracle does not offer subcapacity licensing. You know, with Microsoft, you buy a product, you get a license key, you do the installation, you supply the license key. So it's not that easy to install something that you're not entitled to. With Oracle, you can. They don't have license keys. You can just get the software from the site and install it. So what's important about that is when you install the database product, you're liable for a license, which you'd probably expect. You install it, you know, you should be paying for it. But the options and packs are different. Even though you install the database and you might say, yeah, give me all those options and packs, you're not liable for them until you use them. So Oracle wants you to install the database with all the options and packs that are available. And then they say, but if you don't need them, just don't use them and you don't have to pay for them. But you need to be aware of that because it's easy to use them without being aware of it. Okay, so let's talk about the Enterprise Edition first. We'll go in descending order, in this case, from Enterprise down through the lower standards. Anyhow, so if you're doing it by the named user plus license type, which means per user, you need to get at least 25 named user licenses per processor. And again, per processor really means per core. So unlike Microsoft, there's not a price for the server itself. Technically, the server is free, but you have to buy at least this number of user licenses to go with it. So that's effectively a per server cost, but it's different because you purchase it that way, and therefore you've got 25 users off the bat available to you. If you get the processor license type instead, then you license all the physical cores. So just count up all the physical cores on the box and be sure to multiply the cores by the core factor. And unlike Microsoft, where it's pretty much just a minimum of 4, and there are only some rare cases where there's anything more to it, in the case of Oracle, it's important off the bat because many of the Intel processors are counted as half a core. So if you don't take that into account, you'll overpay. And it's one license per processor core. It says per processor license, but that's a typo. So let's go through an example here of the processor license type that we're just talking about. So we're talking about Enterprise Edition. And in this example, we'll have a server that has 2 Intel Xeon CPUs. So 2 CPUs and 4 cores per CPU. So the formula for the number of licenses required is the number of cores times the core factor. So 2 CPUs times 4 cores per CPU is 8. And then we multiply by a half because they're Intel Xeons, which have a core factor of a half. And we get a total of 4. So that would require 4 licenses. And we note some costs here, give you the ballpark figures. Maybe you can negotiate a better deal with Oracle, but you can see, regardless, we're talking about significant amounts of money. Okay, so let's go down to the standard edition. In this case, both license types are available, named user plus or processor. In this case, the minimum of named users is 5. So if you want to get a standard edition license, it'll cost you 5 named user licenses. If you do the processor licensing type, then you license the physical CPUs. So we're not talking about cores anymore. It's just the actual CPUs, which sometimes they just refer to as sockets. So it's 1 license for each of those CPUs. And there is this limitation on the resources of the computer, so you can't run standard on a large server, only on a small server, small by today's standards. So let's go through an example. We'll use the same server as before, a server with 2 Intel Xeon CPUs, and there are 4 cores for each CPU. But of course the cores don't matter here because standard doesn't depend on them. So it's simply that there were 2 CPUs, therefore you need 2 licenses. And some cost examples here. And you can see that the list prices at the standard is a bit under half the cost of the Enterprise Edition. Okay, Standard Edition 1 is a variation on the Standard Edition that's even more downscale. As far as named user licenses go, it's got the same minimum, so it's going to cost you the same amount of money to do the minimum if you're doing it by users. If you do it by processors, same thing. You have to count all the physical CPUs. But in this case, there's a maximum of 2. So it runs on an even smaller box than the standard does. So let's go through an example where we're using the processor license type. Same server as before, 2 CPUs, 4 cores per CPU. And being 2 CPUs, it does meet the maximum limit of 2. And the cores don't matter, so it's just 2 processor licenses. You can see the cost here is $5,800 list, and back on the server it was something like $17,000. So that's the advantage of the Standard Edition 1. It's when you're doing it by processor, the cost per processor is considerably less. So if you have a small database and can run on a very small box and do it per processor, then it's a better deal than the Standard Edition. And finally, at the bottom, we have the Personal and the Express editions. The Personal edition is basically a 1 user edition, so you can't even get it by processor license. You simply purchase it, and you pay for 1 named user license, and that's it. So it's really designed for 1 person, and that's it. And then the Express edition is the free edition. They have to be out there competing with Microsoft, which has a free Express edition, so they do the same thing, and they follow the same strategy. It's very limited by today's standards as far as the resources. On the other hand, there are a lot of things you can still do with a gigabyte of memory and 4 gigabytes of user data. That's still quite a lot for many uses. So something to keep in mind. It might meet some of your needs. Let me make sure I didn't skip a slide. Okay. So that's about the database itself. We've mentioned that the options in management packs are really important in Oracle. Just a note, there are no options in packs in SQL Server. You get an edition, and you get all the features of the edition with the edition. But Oracle makes it a little more complicated. Besides the editions, they have these packs and options, which can have very important capabilities. They're very commonly purchased. Sometimes you can get away without any of them, but often you need several of them, especially in the Enterprise Edition. They're basically for the Enterprise Edition. With the Enterprise Edition, all the options and packs are available. None are included by default, at least none that cost extra money. With the Standard Edition, you get the rack, which is the cluster thing. But that's all you can do. You can't actually purchase anymore, so you can't increase the power beyond the basic database. And in the case of Standard Edition 1 in the Express, you don't even get the rack. And of course, you cannot extend it at all. That might seem a little odd, but the Personal actually includes all the options. But that's because it's intended for a single user, probably in development. And if they're developing for an enterprise environment, naturally it's best that they have all the options and packs available so they could develop for any of those. Except for the rack. I'm not sure why that's not there, except maybe they think, well, it's personal and you should run it on one computer, so you don't need the rack. Okay. So let's just look at some numbers on the options, just to give you an idea that you really don't want to overlook these. It's not like they cost a tenth or a 20th as much as the database. They're right up in the same ballpark. So if you get some options compared to the base database, your cost can double, triple, quadruple. So in this case, we're talking about using the rack, the real application cluster, to spread the database over 2 machines. So you get the power of 2 machines. So we're going to use the same kind of servers as before. That is 2 CPUs, and each CPU having 4 cores. But now it's 2. So basically, we just double what we had before. Before it was the 2 CPUs times 4 cores is 8, times the core factor of a half gave us 4. And now we multiply that by 2 computers, and we get a total of 8 processor licenses. And you see the numbers here. The list cost of the rack is $23,000 per core. It's per core, not per computer. So in our example, with 8 cores, that's 8 times 23,000, nearly $200,000. And that's just one option. And there are other options that are similarly expensive. There are others that cost a half or a third or a quarter of that. But even those can add up. So the point is, you need to know about the options and the packs and whether they're being used or not, because that'll have a big effect on your bottom line. One more issue with Oracle is clusters. So a cluster means a set of servers. And Oracle's very strict about how they treat that to their advantage and your disadvantage. So we have an example here over on the left where we have this, looks kind of like a box with all these slots. There are 10 slots here, and that represents 10 blades in a cluster. And that's often done with VMware, so we're talking about a 10-blade VMware cluster. And let's say you're just running Oracle on one of those blades, so you didn't really get this cluster to run Oracle. You got the cluster for a lot of things and decided to throw Oracle onto it because it was convenient. And Oracle's just occupying the first blade. And let's say each blade has has whatever resources are required that you need for processor licenses by the Oracle rules. At first glance, you might say, okay, it's on that blade. That's a separate piece of physical hardware. It requires 4 licenses. I'm liable for 4 licenses. But Oracle's licensing rules that you sign for say differently. They say that's an integral physical thing. And since you always have to license the whole physical thing, there's no subcapacity licensing. If you do this, you need to get 40 licenses. So the takeaway is you don't want to run Oracle on a cluster that's shared with a lot of other things where Oracle's only using a part of it. And that tends to cause IT departments to dedicate hardware to Oracle. So when they run Oracle on something, they pile it up with Oracle and use all the physical hardware, which they're paying for in any case. Okay, so now we'll go on to the process of achieving compliance. And this is almost identical to what we went through with SQL Server. It's a little less complicated to compute because you don't have to worry about those virtual rules that SQL Server offered, which could save you money. So I don't have any examples here, but I'll go through the rules. So it's the same overall structure. You need to discover what you have installed, compile what you have purchased, organize those by the edition, version, and license type, plus by product, because remember we have the options and management packs, so there's one extra factor to throw in there. So you have to add one more characteristic, which can result in a lot more rows in your spreadsheet. So you do that on both the discovery side and the entitlement side, and then you can compare the like to the like to see your over-under status. So in a little more detail, starting with the Oracle discovery, first get all your installations together, and of course identify each installation, whether it requires a paid license or not. Again, if you have Express, you'll discover you have that, but you don't have to pay for that. I'm not aware of other ways you could license Oracle, although actually Oracle I think does have a developer program called ODN, so it's possible you got something through that for development, and that's a separate rule. But it's the same software, so it might show up the same way in discovery. So you need to identify the additions, and then again the options and the packs. And again, it's not whether the options or packs are installed, although if you just pay for them, you're covered. But as far as saving money, you actually want to identify whether they've been used or not. And then identify the failover servers. And the failover stuff is a little more complicated with Oracle. SQL Server pretty much says something's active or it's a failover. They have rules for that. Oracle has a whole bunch of categories of servers that people might call failovers, but they say, well, this is a failover, and that's a standby, and that's a something else. They have 3 or 4 categories, and only one of them counts as a failover that you don't have to pay for. The other ones, even though you view them as backups or redundancy, they view as actively running. So you need to pay careful attention to that. So once you've got the installations, then you have to turn that into a list of physical servers. And that means you also have to add the physical hosts if you're just running on virtuals. When you have the instances that are listed on the virtuals, you need to make sure you find the physical hosts for all those virtuals. And of course, get the processors and cores for each of those physical servers, since you might need that information when you compute the number of licenses required. So just a few notes, again, that it's important on the VMs. Actually, I think we just copied this from the SQL Server because it doesn't matter about the virtual cores. With Oracle, it's just the physical cores. But it is critical to know the relationship between the VMs and the physical hosts, since you need to know which Oracle instances are running on which physical server. And then finally, for each physical server, you need to do the counting. So if you've just got Oracle running directly on the physical server, then it's pretty easy to apply the rules. If you're running on VMs, then you first have to figure out effectively which Oracle editions, etc., are running on the physicals. And then you can count the number of licenses required according to the rules. So the other side of the coin is the entitlements or purchases. So you organize these the same way you do with SQL Server, except again there's the addition of the product to account for the database and the options and the management packs. I went too fast. And then finally you would compare the two. So again, after you had done things on discovery and had all your instances in your computers and gotten your purchase records, you'd want to summarize each by the product, the edition, the version, the license type, and whether you have maintenance, and then be able to compare the like to like from the purchase side and the discovery side. And then as with the SQL Server in the Bell-managed data analytics module, we have reports dedicated to Oracle licensing that both show you all the installations so you can see the details and develop a worksheet. And then there are summary reports that lets you compare that discovery information to the purchase information. And so this is one that's actually doing just that for a bunch of additions and products. It's comparing the purchase records to the summary records. The logic in this report is doing the kind of things we're talking about. It's the Bell managed product that this goes with that does all the discovery. So you know about your instances and your computers and your cores and CPUs. And that concludes the presentation part. And I'll turn it back over to Sumin, and we're ready to take questions. Either answer something we haven't talked about or go review something that was not clear the first time.
Great. Thank you, Ken. I should point everyone to the URL here. Actually, we list a lot of these rules on our website on this particular page, so feel free to go there, and I think there are SQL Server and Oracle licensing metrics rules on that page. So